Welcome to the first annual Native Docent Education Fund Lecture. I'm very happy to see everyone here. And at this time, I would like to introduce to you Nada's family. And I would like you to stand so we all can see that you're here. David, please, of course. Andy, Scott, and Matt, and Alex, Colleen Delaney, and Scott's friend, Karina Harper, and her daughter, Savannah Harper. Now, did I miss anyone, David? Thank you for being here, and thank you for allowing us to have such a marvelous opportunity. Thank you. I would also like to welcome our new members of our docent class. And I don't have all their names in front of me, but I would like all of the new docent class to please stand. We have several of them here this evening, thanks to Kristen. And then, it's just a big welcome to everyone else that's here. So we're very happy that all of you can be here. So at this time, Phyllis, would you like to introduce our speakers?
Can you hear me? Yes. Maida Kleiman was a docent for 22 years, and she loved it, and over the years served on countless programs and committees and was a member of the European Corps. She had a boundless love of both learning and art, which dovetailed exactly with the aims and the goals of the museum. It was a perfect match. She had a wealth of interests, from travel to gardening to many others, and brought that knowledge to her work here. Maida was curious and liked to travel a lot. There's a book, I think it's called 1,000 Places to See in Your Lifetime. Maida was the only person I know who came very close to seeing them all. She brought back images from those trips and incorporated them into her tours. And while she'd be talking to kids, 4th and 5th graders, about the art on the walls, she made that art come alive. And this is what we all try to do, but she was just very good at it. So many of her strong friendships were formed through her ties to the docent program, and she found them an enormous source of strength over the last several years. Last winter, some of these friends wanted to do something at the museum in her memory, and we thought about the possibility of funding a lecture, and talked to her husband, David, who had already had a similar idea, which he wanted to see expanded into a permanent program of periodic lectures or events to further docent education. And with a very generous contribution from the Kleiman family, that idea was realized. And tonight marks the first Maida Kleiman Docent Education Fund lecture. I think Maida would have been delighted. Thank you. Alan B., our European art.
Thank you, Phyllis, and welcome, everyone. I want to say, as a curator, that so many times we are the very indulged and lucky beneficiaries of kind words from the docents. I've always said the docents are the best audience anywhere, but I would like to assure you that that appreciation works both ways. And it's extremely satisfying for a curator to see our docents providing IMA visitors with meaningful engagements with works of art. I have my own particularly distinct memory of Maida, and it took place a couple of years ago in the American Gallery on a Sunday afternoon, and I met up with her about on the west side of the gallery, in the sort of in the American Impressionist area. She was surrounded by people. This was not a required tour with a school group or a certain group who had come in from the outside. It was her own extended family. And what I witnessed there was the great enthusiasm that she had for sharing her love and her understanding of the art with members of the family of all ages. As I recall, there was even a babe in arms, little Jordan Picard, as I recall. So it was wonderful to see the whole family there and her palpable love for something that she did so well. When the education department informed me of the generous contributions in Maida's memory and the desire to establish a docent education fund with an inaugural lecture devoted to European 19th century art, in a heartbeat, the ideal candidate appeared in my mind. And I'm happy to say that she accepted our invitation with all the grace of spirit and intensity of preparation that characterize the work of Jane Block. There is simply no scholar working in America today who is better qualified to speak to us on Belgian art just before and after the turn of the 19th century. And actually, you might well extend that declaration to include Belgium as well, no matter how they divide themselves up at the moment in that country. Dr. Block graduated from Vassar College, Phi Beta Kappa, with a degree in French literature. She earned master's and doctoral degrees at the University of Michigan, writing her dissertation on many of the Belgian artists you will hear her address tonight. As if that were not enough, Jane also holds a graduate degree from Simmons College of Library and Information Science. Now you will understand how logical it is that she served both as head of the Art and Architecture Library at the University of Illinois, the Ricker, and as the Turin Endowed Professor at that same university. Jane is the first scholar to earn the honor of serving in this endowed professorship position. And in fact, her investiture took place at the university just last month. And I might add, she chose as an illustration for the program our magnificent double portrait by Georges Lemaine, which you also found on your invitation for this evening's program. In her capacities as educator, researcher, and scholar, Jane is uniquely qualified to appreciate the learning and the teaching so coveted by a great docent. And in keeping with that, Jane said to me just a few minutes ago, would you please tell the docents that I'm giving the museum a CD and I will be providing a complete text of my talk so they don't have to worry about taking all the notes because they'll have access later. She wants you to just read it. She knows, she gets it. Jane is recognized internationally for her expertise in Belgian avant-garde art, and she has lectured in Paris and Brussels, in French, mind you, as well as at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and actually also at the IMA in, do you remember, 1983. A prolific writer, Jane has contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs on both sides of the Atlantic. Her book of edited essays, entitled Belgium, the Golden Decades, 1880 to 1914, won the Worldwide Prize for Scholarship from the Art Library Society in 1997. She's also published extensively on Belgian book and poster design. Jane also holds a position as the associate member, or an associate member, of the Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences in Belgium. I'm happy to say that I am working with Jane on a project that we hope to launch for the IMA. So you will hear more about that at a later date. I hope I can tease your curiosity. But for tonight, please help me welcome a scholar of impeccable quality, my friend and colleague, Jane Block.
Well, what a great honor and pleasure it is to be with you all this evening. I can't think of a better venue or gig for me than to be here with all of you tonight. And thank you for that lovely introduction. Made me blush, actually. And I wanted to thank Ellen for also inviting me here this evening. I'm especially honored to speak at the first Meta Kleiman Docent Memorial Lecture, which pays tribute to one of your outstanding docents, who I'm very sorry I didn't have the good fortune to meet. My thanks to David Kleiman and family, and to all the donors who have made this lecture possible this evening. This evening, I will be talking about the Belgian artists included in the Holiday collection, and several other works purchased through the generosity of other museum benefactors. Mr. Holliday amassed a collection that was remarkable in both quality and dedication to Neo-Impressionism in its broadest sense. In other words, he collected not just works by French practitioners, but Belgian, Dutch, and German examples. And he did not limit his collection to those artists who directly knew Seurat, the founder of the movement, but also purchased works created by other artists, influenced in one way or another by Neo-Impressionist principles. You are all undoubtedly familiar with the publications dealing with the Holiday collection, and especially the seminal work written by your very own Ellen Lee, The Aura of Neo-Impressionism, sporting Paul Signac's entrance to the Porte d'Enfleur on its cover. But this evening, we are taking a Belgian holiday, with one L. Yes, Belgium, which is not just a punchline for a Hollywood movie starring Suzanne Plachette. If it's Belgium, this must be Tuesday, but a real place about the size of Maryland that is situated between France and Holland. If I were to ask you what were your first associations when I mentioned Belgium, I think you would most likely list the following, and perhaps not in any particular order. Belgian chocolate, Belgian lace, Belgian waffles or gaufres. I think I must have been hungry when I put this together. Belgian beer. There are over 400 varieties. Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective, so perfectly portrayed by David Suchet. And perhaps even Tintin, the comic book hero. If you have been fortunate enough to visit Belgium, you will recognize the glorious Grand Place. You may have paid attention also to the career of Justine Henin, champion tennis star, and perhaps even heard that Joseph Sax, inventor of the modern-day saxophone, was a Belgian. To these perfectly valid associations, I hope to add a few more before the end of the evening, which are germane to the works in the Indianapolis Museum's collection, and which will help you understand the context in which these fabulous works were created. Okay. First, I would like to quickly review the history of Belgium. Second, to talk about the artistic climate and the various modern movements that flourished during the last 3 decades of the 19th century. And finally, to look at these Belgian works within the collection of the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And now to a very brief history. Belgium is a 19th century political construct, surrounded by France to the south and the west, the Netherlands to the north, and Germany to its east. Its inhabitants since the 15th century have spoken variants of French in the southeast, and Low German or Dutch dialects in the northwest. Situated between these worlds is Brussels, which is indicated on that map with a star, a red star. And Brussels serves as a linguistic buffer and absorbs French and German into the mix. Belgium was ruled by larger powers from the 16th century onwards. the Austrian Habsburgs under Charles V, followed by his son, the Spanish ruler Philip II, until the very end of the 16th century. And then there was a revolt for independence, which finally led to the Netherlands breaking away, leaving essentially what we know today as Belgium and Luxembourg under the Habsburg rule until 1715. Then there was a period of Austrian domination for much of the 18th century, then French, and finally and lastly Dutch. This last rule, under the Dutch king William I, led to a revolt when William tried to impose the Dutch language on all of Belgium and foster his anti-Catholic stance among a staunchly Catholic people. Belgium holds the cultural distinction of having an opera, La Muette de Portici, the mute girl from Portici, which is a Neapolitan port. And if you can imagine that there could be an opera with a mute girl as one of the characters, and it's very strange. Anyway, this opera played a crucial role in the revolt and the subsequent formation of the state in 1830. Within the opera, the Neapolitans are struggling under the yoke of Spanish rule in the 17th century, a parallel situation to the Belgians straining under the Dutch regime in 1830. Following a rousing performance, the crowd, which you see in the left slide, stormed out of the Brussels Opera House, the Théâtre de la Monnaie, which you see on the right, but it's the building on the left-hand side of the right slide. And they stormed out on 25 August 1830, set fire to the buildings and opened revolt against the tyrannical rule. We are going to listen to Daniel Aubert's rousing baritone tenor duet, Amour sacré de la patrie, Sacred Love of Country, which was said to have started the riot. And I think you have to hear the music to understand what inflamed the passions of those opera goers. But before we do that, I just wanted to just briefly go over the lines in case they mystified you. So it doesn't begin this way, but one of the refrains is Amour sacré de la patria, sacred love of country, rends-nous l'audace et la fierté, give us back boldness and strength. À mon pays je dois la vie, to my country I owe my life. Il me devra sa liberté, it owes me its freedom. Nicholas, hit it, please. Thanks. Not so easy to find, I'll let you know. And it's not quite as ferocious as the Marseillaise, but I think you'd agree that it's really stirring, composed of both passionate words and music. So that's what made them revolts, and I'm glad you're all still in your seats. Well, despite rule by successive waves of foreign powers, French remained the primary language of a very powerful minority in Brussels. French had also served as the principal language of administration under the Spanish and Austrians. The historical divisions mentioned earlier remain to this day, and that's what's important to understand. So that to the south and the southeast of Brussels, the French region named Wallonia includes the major cities of Charleroi, Namur, and Liège. The north of Brussels, Flemish is spoken in the region referred to as Flanders, including the principal cities of Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp. And of course, all of this, as you know, is very topical as the current government in Belgium is undergoing a political crisis and talk of schism is at its height. Creating a new country in 19th century Europe meant finding a king to rule it. Leopold I, and uncle to Victoria, future Queen of England, was appointed the first monarch of a new Belgium, reigning from 1831 to 1865. However, the monarch who sat on the throne when much of the art in the Indianapolis Museum of Art was created was his son, Leopold II, who ruled from 1865 to 1909. Okay, so much now for the political outline, just to get you situated. To understand our artistic context, we need to go back in time, prior to the birth of modern Belgium in 1830. Flanders rose to its artistic apogee from the 15th to the 17th centuries, when there was a great richness of local Baroque exuberance, including this wonderful example, which you'll all recognize from the IMA's own collection, of Anthony van Dyck's Entry of Christ into Jerusalem. The 18th and early 19th centuries were characterized by a relative decline in artistic merit. French domination in 1795 led some of the more talented young painters to travel to Paris to benefit from the teachings of Jacques-Louis David, who was, as you know, the leading neoclassical painter. With the downfall of Napoleon, Paris was no longer a safe place for the ex-revolutionary David, so he fled to Brussels in 1816, and for nearly a decade until his death, inspired a renewed vigor in Belgian art, albeit one of neoclassical control. Comparing the de Hempton family by the leading Belgian pupil of David, who was called François Navet, with David's own portrait of Lavoisier and his wife, we see a similar interest in depicting family life. David's portrait of the aristocrat and intellectual Lavoisier, a chemist, and his wife, is a perfect representation of the Enlightenment in pre-revolutionary France. Some 28 years later, David's pupil gives us Monsieur de Hemptin, also a man of science and a chemist, in a private moment of intimacy with his wife and daughter Julie. Though Navet inherited David's technical ability and attention to detail, the contrived simplicity and moral authority of the David are lacking. The Navet is more anecdotal, and you can see the drawers that are open contain his collection of seashells rather than showing him as the great chemist, the comparison to Lavoisier. However, in both works, color, texture, and surfaces are paramount. By the 1820s, art in Belgium was somewhat provincial, lagging behind developments in France. Thus, the painting by Navet could be seen to exemplify modernism in Brussels, whereas by this date, it would have seemed old-fashioned in Paris, where Romanticism was flourishing. One of the best-known pupils of Navet was Alfred Stevens, who was born in Brussels in 1823. Stevens moved to Paris permanently in 1852, and although he returned to Belgium on periodic visits during the course of his life until his death in 1906, it was the latest fashionable French painting of the 1860s that established his style. In the IMA's visit to the atelier, we can observe what made Stevens such a sought-after painter in his own lifetime. His eye for elegantly dressed and fashionable women, for the splendor of painting, the textures and sheen of the garments, as well as an overall delight for detail, including beautiful and expensive objets, made Stebbins popular among collectors, not only in Europe, but in the United States. By 1879, Stebbins could boast of 17 works in U.S. collections, while his counterpart in America, the painter William Merritt Chase, owned at least a dozen of Stebbins' paintings, and that's just to show you how admired he was in the United States. Although Stebbins followed the work of the emerging Impressionists and was a good friend with Degas, Manet, and Manet's sister-in-law, Berthe Morisot, he was never tempted to imitate their work. He was, after all, a full 9 years older than Manet and 17 years senior to Monet. However, like Manet and the Impressionists, Stebbins was also a keen collector of Japanese and Oriental art. And in this work, you see a Japanese screen behind the two female visitors to his studio. And you can note also that the painting includes examples of Stebbins' work, including the seascape in the right-hand corner. And Stebbins excelled at this subgenre of female visitors to his studio, such as Woman in the Atelier, which was painted considerably earlier than the IMA oil, and this gave him the opportunity to show his minute rendition of women and interiors. So there's a whole host of these women in interior scenes that form part of Stebbins' repertoire. Thus, in mid-century, the French attitude toward the Belgians continued to be one of elitism and superiority. As the poet Charles Baudelaire commented during an 1864 visit to Belgium, everything in Belgium is dispirited, sad, insipid, asleep. Okay, so much for Belgium then. However, things were going to change up north in Belgium. If Impressionism had little effect on Stebbins and other established Belgians, it was fully embraced by younger painters who avidly followed the work of the French group that banded together and exhibited in Paris at 8 shows from 1874 to 1886. Impressionism is characterized by its luminosity, loose and spontaneous brushstrokes, and its engagement with scenes of modern life. Monet's Impression Sunrise at the left of 1872, in fact, gave the movement its name. Juliette Witzmann's landscape at the right is representative of Belgian Impressionism. Typical of Impressionism is that much of this painting was executed out of doors, and in order to capture the effects of changing light and time of day, had to be painted quickly, often mixing strokes, painting wet upon wet. Although the Impressionists made use of the power of color contrast, the effect of reds, say near greens, they did so pragmatically and not according to the codified scientific principles that were later adopted by the Neo-Impressionists. The artistic situation in Belgium changed drastically in 1884 when the revolutionary group Les 20, the double X, or the 20, was founded. The goal of Les 20 was to stop at nothing short of a complete artistic resurgence on all fronts, artistic, literary, and musical. In fact, Les 20, in addition to its annual art exhibitions held in Brussels from 1884 to 1893, held lectures, poetry readings, and concerts of new music in the very same exhibition rooms. And you see here a poster up in the left-hand corner in orange indicating that there was a lecture by Paul Verlaine at Les 20, and more to the right side in red, a concert by the Isaïe Quartet. But why was there a need for Les 20 in Belgium? And how did this society come to be synonymous with avant-gardism, not only in Belgium, but in Europe as a whole? In Belgium, as in France, art was controlled by government-run academies and salons. In Belgium, the official salon rotated triennially between the cities of Brussels, Antwerp, and Ghent. Artists who deviated from the artistic norm as set forth by the Academy could be rejected by a jury. If one was lucky enough to have one's work accepted, it could be relegated to an obscure corner. Here's the way the paintings were arranged at the Brussels Salon of 1863, one piled upon another, whether they were in shadow or darkness or whatever, kind of difficult to see. And here is how they were shown at Les Vins in comparison. All the works arranged in one row at eye level, so the works could be examined without fatigue. And we actually can identify some of these works. We can see a work by Sargent and works by Enser and Knopf. But in addition, in order to avoid the favoritism which existed at these exhibitions, these salon exhibitions, placement of work was by lot and grouped according to artists. So once the artist received his space, he could arrange his works as he saw fit at Les Vins. So the Enser would have his own corner and the Knopf would have his own little space, and it was quite different as you saw. But the goal of Les Vins was the repudiation of authority as embodied in the salons. Prior to Les Vins, an artistic career in Belgium was impossible without recognition through the official salon. Artists now banded together to create an independent market of collectors who would respect the artist's individuality and artistic freedom. In order to achieve their goal of toppling the establishment, Les Vins actively sought out the most radical artists of the day to exhibit alongside them. And here's a work of one of them, Georges Lemaine, and his catalog cover for the group. A random sampling of its 10-year invitation list reads like a who's who of art for the 1880s and 90s, with the likes of Whistler, Gauguin, Monet, Renoir, Seurat, Redon, Lautrec, and Van Gogh, having exhibited as invited guests. The importance of Les Vins reached far beyond the tiny borders of Belgium. French artists included in the Holiday collection who exhibited at Les Vins include Engrand, Cross, Denis, Hayet, Luce, Petitjean, Lucien Pizarro, Seurat, and Signac. And Signac actually became a member of Les Vins in 1891. Among the Belgian members of Les Vins included in the IMA's collection are Alfred Finch, Georges Lemaine, Paul van Rijsselberg, Henry van de Velde, and Georges Min. Although Les Vins never promoted a style as opposed to simply the newest art, it directly reflected the changing stream of isms in contemporary art. When it opened in 1884, Impressionism was already a decade old, and thus not exactly radical. But soon this changed. Neo-Impressionism appeared in France in the mid-1880s and at Les Vins in 1887, and it was followed by strong showings of symbolist work and the rising tide of the decorative arts in the following years. All these styles and more came into vogue during the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Many of the artists we will be talking about today dabbled in more than one movement as the definition of what constituted art was changing. Let's look briefly at these movements as they are classically defined, and then we will return to them to study their complexities. Firstly, Neo-Impressionism, as characterized by Theo van Rijsselberg's Big Clouds of 1893. Neo-Impressionism means New Impressionism, a term which pays homage to the group of artists who responded to Georges Seurat's innovative handling of color and line. Yet at the same time, the emphasis in Neo-Impressionism is upon what will be different or new. Instead of wishing to capture the immediate sensation, as the Impressionists did, Neo-Impressionists sought a sense of control, ordering their vision according to systematic laws, particularly the latest scientific theories of color and line. Seurat believed that optical mixture was superior to palette mixture, which the Impressionists had adopted. The mixing of colors on the palette led to a duller result, they claimed, than what had happened when pure colors on the canvas were mixed as light in the eye itself. And the great luminosity and shimmering effect would be achieved in part through the application of small dots of pure color. Secondly, the power of color was enhanced by juxtaposing contrasting so-called complementary colors, red and green or blue and orange. Big Clouds relies on building color harmonies around such contrasts of yellow and violet and orange and blue. At the same time, the consistent application of the dot unifies the painting. Finally, the repetition of horizontals gives it a sense of serenity and balance. There can be no impressionist spontaneity, as everything is planned down to the minutest detail, including the border running around the painting, which serves as a transition between it and the original frame. Looking also at Georges Leman's The Soroy Sisters from 1894, we can admire the application of the technique to portraiture. Here, Leman makes use not only of simultaneous contrast, as in the Van Rijsselberg, but also successive contrast, where the passage of one color necessitates painting its complement, which results in a halo. So that around the heads of the sisters, we see orange contrasted with blue. And note also the inner border as well as the outer stippled frame. Another development found at Les Vins is symbolism, a movement in which the connection to the visible world is of less importance than the symbolic meaning of the object. The Kneeling Youth by Georges Minna in the IMA is a fine example of this. This attenuated kneeling and brooding figure focuses the viewer's attention away from the external world by literally turning inward to capture an unseen world of emotion. The depiction of the ineffable is quintessentially a symbolist quality. As Stéphane Mallarmé, the French symbolist poet, wrote, "To name an object is to suppress 3/4 of the enjoyment of the poem that comes from the delight of defining little by little to suggest there is the dream." Finally, an interest in the decorative arts was based upon a new international artistic platform that included not only the traditional categories of painting, sculpture, and architecture, but expanded the realm of the artist to include the decorative arts. The former distinction between artist and craftsperson was eradicated. Household objects, chairs, rugs, china, light fixtures, and even locks and keys became objects worthy of the artist's attention. Here is a chair designed by the neo-impressionist painter Henry van der Velde with its honest construction methods. And here is a later salad bowl by van der Velde with the application of his swirling blue line applied to Meissen porcelain. Thus, following the arrival of Impressionism at Les Vins, came Neo-Impressionism, Symbolism, and the decorative arts concurrently. 3 movements, all well represented in the IMA's collection. Now let's turn specifically to some of these works in greater depth. Any discussion of Neo-Impressionism must start with its founder, the French artist Georges Seurat. Academically trained, but driven to find scientific explanations for his aesthetic ideas, Seurat developed the theories governing Neo-Impressionism in the mid-1880s, showing his first successes at the last Impressionist exhibition of 1886. He also exhibited at Les Vins 1 year later in 1887, showing 7 works, including the Grand Jatte, which you see on the screen, and this work created an absolute uproar. So important was the display of his work that Seurat himself attended the opening in Brussels, accompanied by his colleague, Paul Signac. An astonished Signac wrote to their mutual friend, Camille Pizarro, "I left the exhibition exhausted. An enormous crowd, a dreadful mob, very plainly anti-artist. In short, a great success for us." Seurat's canvases were impossible to approach. That's how enormous the crowd was. I think that gives you a good flavor of, the reception of this work. According to Signac, Alfred Stevens, who we talked about earlier, had seen the Grand Jatte in 1886 in Paris at the 8th and last Impressionist exhibition. He could not simply believe his eyes. So affronted was he by the Grand Jatte that he shuttled back and forth to the exhibition with colleagues to mock its creator and the painting. In Brussels, too, most critics attacked Seurat. We see here members of Les Vins portrayed as clowns. And you can note the parody of a sculpture by Georges Minna, on the right-hand side there, with reference to work also of Seurat in the title, La Parade, and not only in the title, but also in the disposition of the figures on the stage. So critics ridiculed Seurat's dot-like brushstrokes mocked his use of the scientific method as anathema to the creative spirit, and claimed that his canvases were experiments and not paintings. Yet patronage by enlightened Belgians played a significant role in Seurat's success at Levin. The Belgian poet and critic Emile Raharn purchased L'Hospice et la Farde en Fleurs on the left, and another painting, La Grève du Barbutin en Fleurs, at the right, was also acquired by a Belgian, an art patron, and still resides in Tournai to this day in Belgium, the painting on the right. By the spring of 1887, Brussels was on its way to becoming what has been characterized as the second home of Neo-Impressionism. Now, Alfred William Finch, called Riddy, was a founding member of Levin. He was probably the first Belgian artist to adopt Neo-Impressionism. At the close of the Levin exhibition in 1887, where the Grand Jatte was shown, he wrote to Paul Signac, "I was profoundly moved by the canvases of Monsieur Seurat and Pizarro." And for the next year, for the 1888 Levin show, Finch submitted the dotted drawing on the left for his catalog entry, alongside landscapes that were painted according to Seurat's theories. Critics labeled the new Neo-Impressionists as les boubonistes, equating the spots accompanying the bubonic plague with the dots of Neo-Impressionism. Even the poster for the 1889 exhibition, probably designed by Theo van Rijsselberg, drew the ire of the critics, and that's the poster on the right. The dot is in full fashion. The wafer triumphs along the gallery wall. The poster itself has not escaped attack. Smallpox has spotted it abominably. But the virus could not be contained. The number of Neo-Impressionist canvases increased dramatically at Levin in 1890, and Finch exhibited 6 works, among them Indianapolis, The Road to Nieuwpoort. The reductivist view of the Belgian landscape near the North Sea owes much to Seurat's orderly schemes. The painting is built on contrast, such as the opposition of luminosity of sky and road with shadow, and the juxtaposition of the telegraph poles representing modernity with the herd of sheep, symbolizing the pre-technological or agrarian age. The treatment of the dot is not uniform. Note the large stippling in the left-hand corner of the sky in contrast to more regular, well, somewhat more regular and smaller dots in the grass upon which the sheep graze. Another of Finch's canvases from the same time and shown at the same Levin of 1890 and at the same place, the Nieuwpoort Channel, is at the top left. The light effects created here and the simplicity of composition recalls Seurat's painting En Fleur Evening at the bottom, and Finch saw this work at Levin in 1887. Finch's composition is even more abstract as we are no longer wedded to the shore, but are immersed in the channel itself. After 1892, Finch turned increasingly to the decorative arts, becoming a master ceramicist. Here we see a ceramic piece from the Pottery Center of Virginal, produced for the Belgian Maison d'Art, a forerunner of Siegfried Bing's Parisian Art Nouveau gallery. This vase, with its lustrous brown and green glaze and abstract swirling motif derived from nature, shows the artist's commitment to craftsmanship. When Finch's work was first shown at the successor to Levin, La Libre Esthétique, in 1897, it was discovered by Count Louis Spar of Finland, of all places, who offered Finch a position at his ceramic factory. Finch spent the rest of his life in Finland, where he became a teacher of ceramics at the Central School of Industrial Arts in Helsinki. Typical of his work in Helsinki is this beautiful blue glaze with orange undercolor, reflecting folk art. Finch was instrumental in the stimulation of modern art in Finland. Like Finch, Henry van de Velde was also swept up by the modernity of the Neo-Impressionist movement. He later recalled the unforgettable impact of Seurat upon him when he was barely 24. Coming into contact with the Grand Jatte, I was thrown into disorder and fell prey to an inexpressible agitation. From that moment on, it was impossible for me to resist the need to assimilate as quickly and as conscientiously as possible theories, rules, and fundamental principles of the new technique to test its validity. And so two of Van de Velde's work in the collection, The Old Peasant Woman, pastel on paper from 1887-88 on the left, and his portrait of his brother-in-law's father, Père Biart, reading in a garden from 1890-91, reveal the transformation of Van de Velde's style after coming into contact with Seurat's work. In The Old Peasant Woman, Van de Velde shows his passion for rural themes that also interested such earlier Barbizon painters as Jean-Francois Millet, whose Peasant with a Wheelbarrow is in the IMA collection. Millet emphasizes the heroic nature of the task at hand, where the worker is sanctified by a golden light, while in Van de Velde, we view the old woman in her environment. She is brought up close to the picture plane, her head bent forward with fatigue as she responds to the almost overwhelming pulsating sensation of heat from the yellow colors, which is relieved only by the blue tonalities that Van de Velde uses. 3 years later, in Père Biart, Van de Velde has rendered this surface uniform with the application of the dot. The color scheme has cooled and is based on combinations of green, blue, violet, and pink, primarily interested in the two-dimensionality of the work and its decorative qualities. Van de Velde stresses the curvature of the path, the scroll-like quality of the armrest, the hat of the sitter. He omits the front legs of the chair, using the model's legs as a substitute. However, the lack of shadows under Père Biart's feet and the chair pad that slides forward, as well as the shoe which seems detached from the leg, makes Père Biart seem to float. The spatial inconsistency reveals what Van de Velde has chosen to privilege: abstraction and overall surface design over plasticity. Van de Velde continued to paint in the neo-impressionist mode, as we see in his childhood landscape. But here is where the various isms blur or combine. Although working in the neo-impressionist style, the artist has evoked the mood of a childhood memory more than rendering an earthly scene. It is as much symbolist as neo-impressionist. Around 1895-96, Van de Velde abandoned painting altogether, devoting himself to architecture and the decorative arts. Inspired by the ideals of the arts and crafts movement, Van de Velde and his fellow Belgian artists sought to raise the decorative arts to the status of painting and sculpture. To some, paintings became anathema because they were unique creations purchased by the wealthy and were not accessible to all strata of society. Van de Velde responded to the writings of John Ruskin, William Morris, as well as the anarchist philosophers such as Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, which emphasized the role of the artist as a catalyst for change in society. Thus, Van de Velde concluded that the path to artistic reform was through the decorative arts. He exhibited this tapestry, The Angel's Watch, at Les Vins in its closing year, 1893. Its religious subject matter is related to Gauguin's Vision After the Sermon on the right, which was also shown at Les Vins in 1889. In the Van de Velde, Belgian maidens are present at the birth of a newborn child. The birth is not only that of the child, which represents the spiritual beliefs of the peasant, but corresponds to the artist's reformation of handicraft and his own rebirth as an artist through the decorative arts. The serpentine road, the undulating trees, and the use of contrast and complementary colors of red and green contribute to the intensely spiritual and evocative nature of the work. Van de Velde lent his talents to the poster arts, and his Tropon graphic shows the artistic partnership he desired with industry. His poster for the Tropon company features their product, Eiweiß, and you can see that written down there in the corner, by replicating the fluidity of egg whites pouring from the eggshells. You'll see it if you look. Although it tends towards abstraction, the Art Nouveau serpentine line captures perfectly the viscosity and flow of the egg white. These arabesques and fluid lines were used on a dinner service that Van der Velde created for the Meissen Porcelain Company. This blue salad bowl on the left is in the IMA's collection, but there were other pieces created as well, as you see on the right, in this blue color. However, the service was also available in this very powerful yellow. When nested, the pattern formed is striking, and so each piece functions as a separate item, but also in harmony with those around it. This idea of creating for an ensemble was also part of Van der Velde's thinking when he designed clothing for women. Album Damenkleider, or the portfolio of women's clothing, reflects the close collaboration with his wife, Maria. Van der Velde designed this cover, while Maria wrote an essay on the designs and served as model in several of the photographs. Here is a tea gown designed for Maria by her husband. And he also did this chair on the left in the IMA. And he designed the chair for a house that he shared with Maria after their marriage in April 1894. On the right, you see that the chair was originally caned and not leather. In their home that he designed, Blumenwerf, which you see in a historic photograph at the top, Van der Velde was able to design every aspect of the house, including its interior furnishings. He designed the wallpaper, he designed the silverware, he designed all of Maria's clothing. The chairs, composed of unpainted oak, that you see at the bottom, are caned and free of ornamental flourishes. The structure is deliberately visible, and they have a handmade as opposed to machine aesthetic. The variety of the chairs from the dining room is shown here. Even a high chair is there. The one in the IMA, as I said, was covered in leather, giving it a somewhat more elegant feeling and not sort of a folk arty feeling or peasant kind of feeling. Theo van Rijsselberg remained loyal to Neo-Impressionism far longer than any of his Belgian confrères. In his big clouds, which we saw earlier, Van Rijsselberg mastered the geometric arrangement of the composition in distinct areas of sand, sea, and sky. He has also reduced the composition to its utter simplicity and produced an overall decorative effect with the irregular shape of the clouds. The predominant palette of yellow, violet, and orange and blue produce an effect of tranquility and serenity. In addition, the painted border is predominantly dark blue, but it's also stippled with colors which repeat the complementary harmonies of the oil. Just a word about the frames of these works, which are often today missing, although you have a great reproduction of this frame in the gallery that was produced for it, so you can get a really great idea of what it's like, what it was like. Neo-Impressionists originally favored white frames, but Seurat also experimented with painted borders and frames, which were to serve as a transition from the canvas to the viewer's space. And these were also repeated by his Belgian followers. So this idea of this transition and border was also taken up, and the Neo-Impressionists felt that varnish was anathema because it would change, it would alter the color of the painting harmonies they so carefully calculated. Of all the Belgian Neo-Impressionists, Van Rijsselberg produced the greatest number of portraits, such as this one as the violist Irma Seth, who happens to be a sister of Maria van der Velde, was married to Henry. Portraiture was an area in which the Belgians excelled and in which they expanded the range of the Neo-Impressionist movement. The portrait tradition remained viable in France and Belgium and continued to provide a challenge to serious artists. However, as this editorial commentary makes clear, there were now more hazards for the sitters themselves. Here, a respectable young woman having been portrayed by 4 modern painters, among them a Neo-Impressionist on the left-hand one, has been reduced to tears. Neo-Impressionism is represented here by the term pointillism, which refers to the point, or the dot, of which the paintings are composed. And Seurat himself created only one oil portrait, that of his lover, Madeleine Knobloch, to which he gave, I think, the amusing and neutral title, Young Woman Powdering Herself. This work had great impact on the Van Teese, as this full-length portrait of Irma reveals. The portrait is as much about Irma's sumptuous dress as it is about the fact that she is an accomplished violinist. She was, in fact, a pupil of Isaïe, the famous violinist and composer. The puff sleeves and pleats of the dress enliven the composition, as do the dots, which are pink, blue, red, green, and orange, especially visible at her hemline. Ringlets of Irma's hair echo the arabesques and fluidity of her dress, while the long vertical panels provide her with both an anchor and a frame. As in many 17th century Dutch compositions, we are allowed a glimpse into the adjoining room where a listener in quiet reverie has succumbed to Irma's playing. The relaxation in the visible hand has set up a contrast between the active violinist and the contemplative listener. Van Rijsselberg, like Finch and Van der Velde, was also interested in the decorative arts and illustrated many books for his friend, the writer Emil Verhaeren. In addition, in what is now, or should be a familiar pattern to you, he created posters, jewelry, silverware. In Georges Lemaine's portrait of the Soroy sisters of 1894, Lemaine melded the neo-impressionist style with the modern symbolist qualities of meditation and dreaminess, yet still referred to older Flemish traditions. The precise details of the tablecloth or the money plant echo works by Roger Campin or Jan van Eyck, 15th century Northern Renaissance artists. The two sisters, Berthe, age 12, and Jenny, age 8, were family friends of Lemaine, and Lemaine gave art lessons to their eldest sister, Yvonne, who became a well-known sculptor in her own right. The prosperous family owned a textile mill, and it is tempting to think that the decorative tablecloth and the girls' dresses were manufactured there. This is not a sentimentalized image of childhood, reflecting perhaps the close ties of Lemaine to Berthe and Jenny, because he represents them as individuals. Jenny does not shy away from the viewer as she coolly glances in our direction. She actually lived to a ripe old age of 97, whereas unfortunately her not very much older sister died quite early in life. Lemaine uses the principles of neo-impressionist theory, which perhaps deserve another word. The vibrancy created by the juxtaposition of complementary colors was long known to painters on an empirical level. However, Lemaine learned from Seurat and his friends about Ogden Rude's influential book, Modern Chromatics, which paired complementary hues in a categorical manner and produced the two principal neo-impressionist tenets mentioned earlier, simultaneous and successive contrast. For simultaneous contrast, which intensifies color, Lemaine relied on complementary colors to produce powerful contrast, blue and orange, red and green. The red and orange color of the dresses is echoed by the green and blue dots of the background. For successive contrast, a halo effect would be produced in sunlight when one strong color produces a surrounding after image of the colors opposites, as in the heads of Berthe and Jenny, where orange is contrasted with blue. Also, most unusual is the surviving painted frame, which is used a la Seurat as a transitional area. Where Lemaine has painted red on the dresses, he counters with a green. Where the background is painted blue, Lemaine will respond with a warmer tone of pink. Shortly after this painting, Lemaine tired of neo-impressionism, but unlike Van der Velde, did not abandon painting entirely. He continued to produce many charming scenes of domestic family life, such as this portrait of his daughter Lise, which is done in a sort of manner a la Bonnard or Vuillard. However, Lemaine was very much taken with the call to reform society through the decorative arts, as was Van der Velde and Finch, and also produced book designs, including these two striking Art Nouveau covers for the 1891 Les Vins, which you saw earlier, and now I'm showing the 1891 and the 1892 cover to the exhibition catalog. He also designed end paintings, which you see on the left. They're quite beautiful and very, very varied. and also designs for rugs, which I only know from this historic photograph. I've never actually found one of the rugs, but they were manufactured. And he even designed door locks and keys. George Moran's Sunday Afternoon is one of about a half dozen surviving neo-impressionist works by the artist. Although not a member of Les Vins, Moran was clearly influenced by what he was able to see of their work in Brussels and Paris, where he studied. His choice of the title, Sunday Afternoon, is an obvious homage to Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the island of the Grand Jatte. However, whereas the Seurat, of course, is an outdoor scene filled with pleasure seekers, the Moran is a portrait of a single individual in an interior. We do know that this is a portrait, as Moran exhibited it in 1893 and 1894 with the word portrait after the title. However, we have not yet discovered the specific identity of the sitter. The old woman at the window is shown in profile, coiffed with a Flemish bonnet, sporting a cashmere shawl. Neither the interior filled with the wondrous globes, which you see on that armoire piece of furniture, neither the globes, which perhaps contain her dried communion flowers or religious icons, nor the sitter's dress evokes the upper bourgeoisie. Here we most probably have a portrait of a domestic who is intent on watching the streetscape, which only she is allowed to glimpse. Is she perhaps waiting for friends or family to step out for the afternoon? The curious object to the right, before the mantel of the fireplace, is a stove for the preparation of food. The horizontal bar, which you see, was for drying linens, and the inverted U-shaped handle could be lifted to supply the stove with coal to heat the oven. Moran chooses to show us only a partial view of the stove, with its interplay of knobs and handles. These curves set up a rhythm which is echoed by the globes and by the woman's back and chair. The woman also seems to be hermetically sealed, as are the globes, compressed in this confining space. What interests Moran is the intricacy of rendering the filtered golden light coming through those diaphanous curtains and illuminating the brilliance of the cape. The cape is shown in sunlight and in shadow, a tour de force of neo-impressionist color theory. And just to show you, Moran in black and white, Moran also created this beautiful Conte crayon drawing, Under the Lampshade, the same year as the Sunday Afternoon oil. Depicting what is probably Moran's father and mother, the painting shows his interest in the decorative aspects of the work with the sinuous and organic form of the oversized armchair, the volute of the table, the shoulder of the female reader, the base of the lamp, and the gleeful wingspread of the adorning angel. There is a somewhat terrifying effect created by the overscaled lamp and the armchair and the spatial ambiguity of the background. Is this a reflection in the mirror or a space that continues? His interest in pattern and sinuous line is also reflected in Moran's decorative artworks, such as the gold brooch on the left and the silver belt buckle on the right. Well, here's an artist who really mystifies me, as Ellen will tell you sometime. William Jelly is another artist who, though never having exhibited with Les Vins, was drawn to neo-impressionism. A bureaucrat working for the Ministry of Railroads, Jelly studied for a short time at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Brussels and turned his attention to architecture, designing his own house and others for his colleagues in the ministry, as well as sculpture and painting. He was drawn to neo-impressionism because of an equation of the style with avant-gardism. It is tempting to think that the sculpture in the background may be a creation of Jelly's, but this is only a speculation. It is really weird if you try to figure out what it is. I am still trying to ascertain the identity of the sitter. Its museum has it as Alfred Verhaeren, and it could well be. But I also have not ruled out the possibility that it is a self-portrait of the artist. And so, these are the major early Belgian followers of Seurat. The Van Tiest Finch in the upper left, Van de Velde lower left, Van Rijsselberg upper right, and the men lower right. And the two outsiders, who we just saw, Moran and Jelly, all well represented in Indianapolis. Now, The Holiday collection also contains quite a few Belgian works by the next generation of artists who were influenced by Neo-Impressionism. Seurat's faithful French follower, Paul Signac, had remained loyal to the movement, but his art had changed. Instead of employing dots, he started to employ brick-like strokes of intense color. Some of the later Belgian artists, such as Louis Campier, which you see a work on the screen, had personal friendships with Signac, actually knew Signac. As the Campier's landscape with bathers attest. Not only does the landscape reflect Signac's interest in the south of France, where he had a home in Saint-Tropez, but it also corresponds to Signac's later interest in the liberation of color. And this Mediterranean idyll is made vibrant with thick strokes of orange and green. And we'll look at just two others of these. Similarly, Jean van den Eekhout depicts his own garden in the south of France with his wife and child. Van den Eekhout has ties directly to Leguin, as his uncle, Isidore Verheiden, was a founding member, and through him knew Le Maine and Van Rysselberg. The artist captures the power of the Mediterranean sun as it showers the artist's wife in radiant light. Here we see an homage to Neo-Impressionism in the pinwheel formed by the vibrant strokes of color circling the head of Madame. And finally, one of the most kinetic works in the Holiday collection is that by Fernand Verhagen, his Flowers and Fruit, circa 1904. From the torrent of color that descends obliquely to the sweeping circular motion of flowers and vase, the entire canvas is alive and in motion. Even the statue seems to respond by bending to the swirling energy, and the curve of its arm is echoed by the shape of the vases and the rounded forms of fruit, as well as the eye of the peacock feather. Again, we see a complete liberation of color that owes much to the direction forged by the Neo-Impressionists. Symbolism is most strikingly represented in the IMA with Georges Minna's kneeling youth on the left, showing an adolescent male nude with bent head clasping his shoulders. It is symbolist in content because of its emphasis on anti-materiality and expressiveness. One of the initial concepts was this figure on the right in marble of a kneeling youth looking more realistic because of the detailing in the hair and because the figure has a bit more flesh and seems still of this world. Minna's most famous work incorporating a variant of this figure in the IMA is the fountain with kneeling youths, which reproduces the same figure in the pose of the Indianapolis Museum's work, repeated 5 times. The work was executed in white marble for the German art patron Karl Ernst Osthaus and adorned his home. It survives today in Essen in the Folkwang Museum, but also was executed in plaster and bronze. Here we can see that it was one of Van Velde's prized possessions at his home in Blumenberg, and that is actually Henry Van der Velde, his wife Maria, and one of Henry's designs dresses for her, and that white sculpture in the background behind Henry's head is a version of the Minna. This pared-down figure is in a pose of supplication, and the tilt of the head downward conveys a feeling of introspection, accompanied by melancholy resignation with the arms embracing the shoulders. No interaction transpires between the figures, which only serves to strengthen the psychological distance. The group figures are elongated, which makes them appear even more abstracted. All Minna's work seems to be about self-containment. But Minna would only have had to look at Rodin's work of the 3 shades, executed for the top of the gates of hell, to see the power of the replicating figure. And it is, in fact, that's where he got the idea, probably, of replicating the figure. However, there's a great difference between this Rodin and the Minna. In the Rodin, where the figures remain plastic, muscular, and interactive, in the Minna, they are dissipated, emaciated, and isolated. Of course, the Indianapolis kneeling youth is composed of plaster covered with golden shellac, whereas the fountain's figures are marble. The whiteness of the marble reinforces the coldness and despair, whereas the burnished quality of the shellac exudes a spiritual intensity and primitive heat a golden aura of otherworldliness akin to Gothic sculpture. And as you know, sculpture by definition is three-dimensional, plastic, and Minna seems to defy those conventions by stripping away as much of the figure as possible, tending towards abstraction and linearity. This is akin to Minna's drawing style, which we see here and where we find the same sense of despair, quiet resignation, and the symbolist work of his friend, Maurice Maeterlinck. And I understand that you own several volumes of Maeterlinck's works. In his frontispiece to Maeterlinck's Fair Showed, or Greenhouses, Minna reflects perfectly the hothouse landscape of Maeterlinck's poems. The atmosphere is heavy, oppressive, as shrouded figures, and you can only really see them because of the white highlights on their faces, lie completely still in a landscape of ferns, rocks, and weeping willows. Although they are in close proximity to the other figures, there is no interaction among them. According to Maeterlinck, the world is an artificial greenhouse peopled by motionless figures who symbolize resignation and despair. Minna responds to the spirit of Maeterlinck's work, using abstraction and sculpture to render a state of mind akin to the symbolist ennui. And, alas, our Belgian holidays have reached their end. And I hope that through our rapid journey this evening, through Neo-Impressionism, symbolism, and the renaissance of the decorative arts at the end of the 19th century, we have realized the richness and diversity of this exceptional collection of Belgian works in the IMA. If I have not been able to touch on all of them, or to do justice to those that I have included within the time constraints, I hope you can forgive me. However, I am more than consoled by the happy realization that you have the opportunity to experience these works firsthand in the galleries. I know that you will be studying them and in turn explaining their complexity and importance to visitors in the museum. I wish you many happy hours in their company, and I thank you very much for your time.